Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Bruce Benson about eminent domain. Dr. Benson is a senior associate of the Independent Institute and formerly was a professor of economics at Florida State University. He is the author of the article The Mythology of Holdout as a Justification for Eminent Domain and Public Provision of Roads, and of the book Property Rights, Eminent Domain and Regulatory Takings Reexamined. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/eminent-domain. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. So let's start out with the definition. What is eminent domain?
Eminent domain refers to the power that government has to take property from individuals without their permission or agreement. So it's as opposed to perhaps government going out and buying property. They force people to sell. In some places, they actually refer to it as forced sales rather than the eminent domain. In the Fifth Amendment to our Constitution, the government is constrained in its use of eminent domain to, in the sense that they're supposed to only seize properties that are for public use, and they are supposed to pay just compensation for the seizures they make.
So what are the arguments put forth by advocates of eminent domain, or at least people who are okay with its being used?
Well, the typical argument has to do with government trying to put together or combine a number of contiguous pieces of property, perhaps for a road or a park or a school or something like that. And the argument is that when they do that, let me step back. These are things that supposedly the government has to provide, and because the market won't. I disagree with that argument most of the time, but the argument then goes, since government is supposed to provide these things, they have to put together these pieces of property. And there is incentive for individual landowners to hold out until they're the last one to sell, because then they can force the government essentially to pay a much higher price than people who have voluntarily sold. So to avoid, and of course, everyone would have the same incentives to hold out, presumably, and so the government wouldn't be able to purchase these things through the market, and they have to therefore use their coercive power to force sales.
Okay, and you started to touch on this a little bit, but what are some of the ways and some of the areas in which we see eminent domain being used?
Well, early on, it was for roads in particular. They would use eminent domain, for instance, if they were going to build a dam and flood property behind the dam. They would use eminent domain actually to seize property for individuals who might want to build a dam. They of course, have used eminent domain to seize property for things like post offices and schools. These are public use categories, but over time, the definition of public use has changed dramatically, at least according to the Supreme Court. So these days, they will seize property, use eminent domain in order to transfer that property to private developers who are developing shopping centers or large stores. They will use eminent domain to supposedly alleviate blight by seizing a lot of private property and turning it over to some other land developer to build new high-rises or apartments or office buildings and things like that. So there's a lot of use of eminent domain now, which involves actually transferring private property from one owner to another through government power rather than through the market.
Okay, and I don't want to get too far into this, but you did mention that the Supreme Court's definition of public use has changed a little bit. And when the topic of eminent domain is brought up, a lot of people will probably think of the Kelo decision. So can you talk about how that definition has changed and what exactly the Kelo decision was?
Well, the Kelo decision has to do with a seizure of property actually in Connecticut, where New London, Connecticut chose to seize a fairly substantial number of private pieces of property in order to transfer that property to Pfizer Corporation, who had promised to build a new headquarters and various other new properties, various apartments and things like that for workers at the new Pfizer plant. So the New London seized the property. The property owners themselves, of course, resisted, and ultimately the case went to court. Actually, the Institute for Justice represented the parties because, of course, most individuals are unable to come up with the kinds of funds that would be necessary to fight a case all the way through the Supreme Court. The government, New London, Connecticut, won at the Supreme Court because the court said that essentially whatever the government says is public use, and that the use in this particular case had expected public benefits, even though it was a transfer to another private party. Similar cases that came before. The really important addition with this case was that if an eminent domain taking facilitated a local plan, development plan, land use plan, then it was legitimate according to the Supreme Court. So whatever government now says is public use, and if they've got it in their local plan, then that makes it really unchallengeable.
Okay, and do you know of any statistics regarding the use of eminent domain, particularly in the U.S.?
Unfortunately, there is not that I'm aware of. The Institute of Justice actually has published a number of case studies, and they have one volume that has a number of examples of regulatory takings, of eminent domain takings. But they don't. In Florida, for instance, you can actually go to the Florida Highway Department and find out what Florida has used eminent domain to take for highways, but there's no compilation of eminent domain takings by local governments or school districts, city governments, that sort of thing. And so it's very difficult to find out how much taking is going on.
Okay. And one issue that is often brought up to suggest that eminent domain is necessary is the holdout problem. So what exactly is meant by that?
Well, That again is the idea that when someone, whether it's government or private individuals, trying to put together a number of pieces of property in order to carry out some project, there are incentives on the part of the seller or the owners of that property to hold out to the end in order to try to extract a very high price. And so every seller who knows that their property is supposed to be part of this larger development has incentives to hold out. That's part of the justification, of course, then for government to do these things, because the holdout problem should affect private efforts as well. So if you wanted to build a private road, presumably the holdout problem would stand in your way.
Right. So let's look at some of the reasons why maybe governments shouldn't be doing these things. So what are some of the problems with eminent domain and the arguments against it?
Well, for one thing, of course, the argument does not apply effectively to private efforts to compile land. Certainly private individuals and private firms have incentives to go to government to use eminent domain if they can get the land cheaper through the government than they can through the market. But the fact is that private entities have and can oftentimes put together large tracts of land without using eminent domain. Disney World, for instance, in Florida, which is a huge amount of land, did not use eminent domain at all to put together those parcels of land. When the government wants to put together parcels of land, of course, they can't do it in secret, I guess you might say, the way Disney did, not announcing their intent, because government always has to have budget hearings and all sorts of things like that, and they're planning 10 years ahead, and so everybody knows what the government is likely to do with their land, or everybody can know at least. So government has problems going to the market to get land, but private sector really can overcome those problems in many ways. Government could take the hint from private sector and do some things too. There's new developments in auction processes where the buyer says, I'll pay this amount for these parcels of land, but everybody has to agree to sell, or I'm not going to buy these parcels. I'm going to go someplace else. Those sorts of things that the private sector can do, and the government typically, because of its sort of rigid bureaucratic processes, typically can't do. If they want a road, they generally map it out before they get the land. A private organization could get the land before actually mapping out the road, conceivably. So the argument as a justification for government provision is really fallacious. The holdout problem, which certainly might arise with private sector purchases, is really not the barrier to private action that people allege. And so then the question goes back to whether the private sector could provide the same sorts of goods, services, as the government does through the use of eminent domain. And there's growing amounts of evidence that the private sector could do many of these things that government is doing today.
So in many ways, eminent domain and the use of it is much more inefficient, much less efficient than if the private sector were totally handling these functions.
Yeah, because it allows the action to take place at lower cost than it should in some cases. There's a natural tendency to underpay when they use eminent domain. I'm not saying anything against Donald Trump at this point, but let me use an example from Trump's casino in New Jersey. He wanted to build a new parking lot for his casino, and so he went to the redevelopment authority and apparently asked them to put together a parcel of land that he could use for this. And so the redevelopment authority went out and informed various parties that their land was going to be seized, and they would be compensated for their land, but the compensation they offered was clearly much lower than the true market value. One individual who had just purchased a business was told that he would receive $250,000 for his property, and he paid $500,000 for it. Another individual who had been offered $1 million for her home by another casino was told that she would get half that amount or less. So government tries to get these properties for lower prices. That encourages the private sector, like Trump Casino, to try to use government to get the property because it's cheaper. But if it's value has a higher value in the market, then that suggests that it's being inefficiently reallocated. It should stay with its previous use.
Right, and one of the arguments sometimes being made in favor of eminent domain is that, well, these people who have homes being taken or own this property, they are being compensated. The Fifth Amendment says they should receive just compensation. Yet the compensation is not something that is mutually determined by the buyer and the seller. It's just determined by one side, and thus it's not just as we might look at other market transactions. Yeah,
supposedly the test established by the Supreme Court for just compensation is market value, but it's the market value that would be arrived at between a voluntary buyer and a voluntary seller, which doesn't occur here, so they have to estimate the market value. And of course, the fact is that most property isn't on the market because the owner puts a higher valued use to that property than the market does. So even the market price tends to underprice the property in terms of the owner's value. The lady who was having her house seized for the Trump parking lot had lived in that house for decades. That's where she'd raised her children, a lot of sentimental value, a lot of personal value in staying in that home. The market valued it at less than that, and so the highest valued use clearly was hers, not what would be determined by the market, and certainly not what would be determined by government use of eminent domain.
Right, yeah, the sentimental value, the comforts that go with being at home, being in a place that you and your family have been for maybe decades in some cases, obviously cannot necessarily be reflected by a court-determined market value.
Yeah.
And this issue of just compensation or unjust compensation is definitely one major problem with involuntary transfer. But what are some of the other issues with involuntary transfer of property?
Well, of course, private property, from a libertarian perspective, it means that the individual's decisions about the use of that property are what count. He may decide to sell it, but whether it's sold or not is his decision. When a government can take your property, it means your property rights are relatively insecure. It means they are less valuable than they would be if they were more secure. There's that constant threat of loss. Most of us probably don't feel that because we don't have a piece of property that sits on a potential roadway or something. But certainly when it happens to you, it is very upsetting. And that's why you have cases like Kilo, where private owners fight so hard to try to keep their property because it actually is taking private property without the consent of the owner. The Fifth Amendment, of course, there's no place in the U.S. Constitution that says explicitly that the government has the power to take property. The Fifth Amendment says that if they take property, they have to take it for public use and they have to pay just compensation, which implies, of course, that they have that power. But if we look at the development of law going back into England, for instance, we see the private sector or the the wealthy and so on fighting over the years to try to constrain government takings, and really this idea of public use and just compensation is intended to constrain government and leave these things in the market, not to justify or provide an excuse for government.
All right, and before we focus on roads in particular, which is where I want to conclude this conversation, one hot-button political issue that is related to eminent domain, and since we mentioned Donald Trump, I guess it's appropriate to mention another political issue, is the Keystone XL pipeline. Mm-hmm. What uses of eminent domain are involved in that and of the construction of pipelines in general?
Well, like Donald Trump, if Keystone can get the property through eminent domain cheaper than they can through the market, that's what they're going to try to do. And we see eminent domain used for right-of-ways for pipeline and those sorts of things that are constructed by the private sector. But lots and lots of pipelines have been constructed without the use of eminent domain. These companies generally are able to put together properties without calling on the government to step in for them. And of course, there's lots more to Keystone than just the use of eminent domain. But they certainly, obviously, all of us, if we can get something cheaper, we want to do it. And so if you can get it through government, that's the incentive. That's why we go to Walmart instead of the mom and pop stores that we used to go to. It's cheaper there. But unfortunately, the government has moved so far into the market now that it's driving out private alternatives.
Right now, I want to turn our attention to roads here, and one of the points, I guess this is sort of the consensus related to roads amongst the broader American public, is that roads are something that only the government can provide, and that it would be next to impossible to envision the market providing roads. Now, that's something that you've questioned over the course of this interview, so can you lay out what would it look like for private roads to be built, and how would that look, not just in the sense of maybe a little road in a neighborhood, but also roads connecting cities and large swaths of land and things of that nature?
Mm-hmm. Well, government provision of roads is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, certainly the Romans built roads to move their armies around, but most roads have always been provided through non-government processes. Even in the United States, many of the early roads in the East were privately constructed roads, as communities wanted to connect with other communities so they could trade and so on. In England, up until into the 1800s, there were thousands of miles of toll roads, which were run by local organizations made up of landowners and other local individuals. They were highly constrained, so it wasn't a private market for roads, but it was a private provision. What happened, of course, was the government increasingly imposed regulations on these private roads or these non-government provided roads that limited their ability to charge efficient tolls, gave privileges to various organizations to use the roads without paying, and so on. So ultimately, that process was undermined not by market failure, but by government action. If we look around the world today, there's lots of private roads as well. A lot of developing countries, we see private construction of toll roads because the government are too inefficient, can't get it done, or they can get it done better by letting the private sector do it. I can certainly envision a system of private roads connecting all of the major markets in the United States quite easily. We have private railroads connecting all of them. The use of roads, the government provision of roads is, as I said, a relatively recent development for the most part. Think of Las Vegas. If there wasn't a government road between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, I suspect that there would be at least one, if not more, privately constructed roads by all those casinos in Las Vegas who are trying to get the gamblers from Los Angeles. And they'd probably do it without tolls because they make their money through the gambling process. So toll roads are not the only private provision process. If you think about local developments, typically anymore, the developer goes in, buys a plot of land, lays it out for construction, builds the roads, maintains the roads, and starts selling the lots. At some point, they may turn those roads over to the homeowners association, but it's still a private organization. And there's just lots and lots of these kinds of private road systems in the United States. So and think of a shopping center is essentially the alternative to traveling to downtown to buy from stores sitting on public roads. Instead, you go into the mall, private parking lot, and you walk through the mall on private corridors provided for you to shop. There's an interesting example of private roads actually where the roads at one point were government roads, but they become private. In St. Louis area, back in the 60s, I think it started, various local residential areas started asking the city governments to turn over the roads to the local community, who would then take responsibility for maintenance and so on, in exchange for the right to control access. Put up a gate if you want to, put up speed bumps to prevent speeders going through your neighborhood, those sorts of things. And a huge number of local neighborhoods ended up doing this in the St. Louis area, so that there's now a substantial system of privately run and maintained roads in the area. It typically results in lower crime rates on those roads because they're privately owned now, and you can kick somebody off if it looks like they're doing something wrong. Traffic congestion is much lower because they are allowed to limit access in various ways and so on. I can envision local communities with private roads, just like many developments, that are maintained by homeowners associations or road owner associations, connected by probably toll roads or other privately provided roads without any problem at all. I mean, we have historical examples of those sorts of things, and we have modern examples of those sorts of things. The biggest problem is we have barriers to those kinds of activities in many places created by government.
Yeah, and what are some of those barriers?
Well, if the government has built the roads initially, they are awfully reluctant to turn them over to the private sector. St. Louis is a very unique example in that way. Lots of roads, of course, have already been built by the government. Many of them were taken over from the private builders and maintainers that built them initially. And probably using something like eminent domain to take them over. The government, of course, has to claim that it's necessary to provide various, quote, public goods. And roads is one that they have claimed to be a public good. If we look closely at many of these public goods, they simply are not true public goods that could be provided by the private sector if allowed. They are goods that simply the government has taken over the market. They often go too far. Certainly the Soviet Union took over all markets and it failed. We have lots of examples of, like in England, where the government has taken over steel industry and coal industry and so on, and those typically fail. But in the case of roads, they've convinced people that they can provide them cheaper. It's not actually cheaper. It's just that the costs are shifted onto taxpayers, so people don't see the connection between what they're actually paying for the roads and the roads that are available.
Right, and 2 points I want to bring up. On the subject of railroads connecting cities, which is something you briefly mentioned earlier, J.J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad is an excellent example of connecting more or less the Twin Cities to Seattle.
Yeah. And
Ayn Rand drew on that inspiration in Atlas Shrugged in the Dagny Taggart character. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, as far as alternatives to toll roads, it's very easy to envision a scenario in which food or gasoline or maybe a general store or grocery store, something like that, would be used by whatever organization or company owns the road in order to fund the road itself instead of having tolls fund it.
Yeah, we had here in Tallahassee, actually an individual just built a private toll road to connect the northeast part of the city more easily to the airport. But we've had examples where individual landowners have actually given property to the government, in this case, in order to build roads, because they know that once that road goes through there, the value of their property is going to get much higher because of access to that road. So private landowners often have incentives to actually build roads just to increase the rental value of their land. Now, since that road was built with this gift of land, huge developments, housing developments and retail developments have been done on that land that was essentially farmland before.
Right. So I want to return to the holdout issue for a moment. What are some alternatives to the some solutions rather to the holdout problem that could be brought about through alternatives to eminent domain?
What Disney did actually was to go through a large number of different agents who went into that area and started buying land. Because they were using a large number of agents, people didn't recognize that it was being put together as a large parcel of land, and so they were able to accumulate virtually all of that land before anyone figured out what was going on. Another example or possibility would be, say, for a private builder of roads or private builder of pipelines or something like that, to consider 2 or 3 different routes, and then inform people along each of the routes that they are considering buying their property for this road or pipeline. But everyone along the line has to agree to sell at a fair price, or they're going to use one of the other methods or one of the other right-of-ways. And so you can essentially create competition between different groups of potential sellers who are probably going to get more than their current market value for the property, but are not going to be able to extract the high kinds of payments that would arise with a holdout problem. And there are processes now being used for firms to buy or obtain services from a large number of individuals, essentially by auctioning off or using an auction process where they say that we don't make any deal until we make all deals. So as long as they're not wedded to a particular parcel of land, you can avoid the holdout problem. That's, of course, the problem with government is because they are having public hearings and they've already laid out the route of the road and so on. They announce it, and it's easy to see potential holdout problems with government being the buyer.
Well, and of course, we've seen many private roads, as we mentioned, many private highways built without the use of eminent domain. I know in your article you cite the Dulles-Greenway road in Virginia, SR 91 in California. So we've seen many, many examples of this.
Mm-hmm. We see many examples of private organizations putting together large contiguous tracts of land. And that's really the issue. Can you put together a sufficient number of contiguous tracts of land to have a road or to have Disney World or something like that? And the private sector does that regularly, unless the government will do it for them cheaper.
Right. All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining me today. I mentioned some resources at the beginning of the show, but if someone is more interested in learning more about what we've been discussing today and in following more of your work, what do you recommend they take a look at?
Well, you could take a look at the Independent Institute website. They have my book on eminent domain and regulatory takings available for sale. They have a book edited by Roth on private roads, the private provision of roads, which has a number of really excellent articles, including a couple of mine. And they have also my book on privatization of the criminal justice process and historical examples of how that would work. So they have a number of things that bear on the kinds of topics we've been talking about.
Great. Well, I want to remind everybody to go check out the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/eminent-domain. And the Mythology of Holdout article will be linked there, and the Independent Institute's website, independent.org, and all the books you just mentioned, including, and I want to mention this again, Property Rights, Eminent Domain, and Regulatory Takings Reexamined. So that will be linked there. wakeupcallpodcast.com/eminent-domain, again, is the show notes page for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on the website to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher or the podcatcher of your choice, and to sign up for the email list. Both ways to ensure that you can stay up to date with the show and avoid missing episodes. And Bruce, I want to thank you so much for joining me today to smash the myth that eminent domain is necessary, and that we wouldn't have roads and we wouldn't have any number of things without the use of eminent domain. So thanks for joining me today and helping me take a look at that.
Sure. I don't know if I smashed very many things, but hopefully I gave some people something to think about.
Right, definitely. And that's definitely a good place to start. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.